essentially, investors from New York bought some land on either side of the river, and from two towns, Methuen and Andover. Some of you may have heard of Andover, Massachusetts. Andover, where George Bush went to school, which is right across. It's probably 3 or 4 miles from here. And actually, the border between Andover and Lawrence is the most segregated border in the country from an ethnic and income standpoint. You know, at one point, Movement City and some of the young people at Phillips Academy, Phillips Andover, organized a march where the Phillips kids came from Andover and our kids came from Lawrence, and they met on the border just to demonstrate that fact. But Lawrence was created as an industrial machine. It's about 8 square miles, very compact on 2 sides of the river. You probably saw a bunch of mill buildings as you came in. There used to be 3 times as many of those buildings just kind of packed along the waterfront to take advantage of water power to create textiles. And that's really why Lawrence exists. So Lawrence is essentially mill buildings and worker housing, and not much more than that. And another way to understand it is that this was a company town. Not unlike a steel town or any other kind of single industry town. It had multiple owners of those mills, but it was essentially, because of the way the unions were organized and the way the owners were organized, it was essentially a company town. And then in the course of, and you guys know the path that these industrial cities took over the last 50 or 60 years, and so Lawrence took that path. It lost its industrial base, lost its downtown to the mall, you know, lost to white flight. And another unique thing about Lawrence is that the demographics here. When I grew up here, and when I grew up here, it was mostly people who looked like me, kind of Western European, 3rd, 4th, 5th generation people, German, Irish, Italian, and now it's 80% Latino. And that happened in about a generation and a half. So a complete flip in the demographics, and it actually didn't lose population. Population today is pretty much what it's been, what it was throughout this whole century. It peaked at about 100,000 at the turn of the last century, but it's mostly been around between 70 and 80,000, and that's what it is. That's what it is today. So this part of the city, North Lawrence, is the oldest part of the city, and it's the most dense and compact. In this neighborhood where I grew up, it's called the North Common. It was an Italian neighborhood when I was growing up. This was a Catholic parish. Lawrence is very Catholic. Churches and bars, pretty much more bars than churches, but generally on every corner you had a bar and a church. And so very Catholic. So and ethnic parishes. So this was an Irish parish. And the vacant lot over here had a big kind of cathedral-like church. This was the one half of the elementary school. That building there, which is called the Hennigan Center, was the rectory, where the priest lived. Across the street was the convent where the nuns lived. And this was kind of this was the centerpiece of this community, this neighborhood. This is where family life happened. And I know you're familiar with that, right? Because some of you have that history, and some of you have other kinds of kind of faith orientations. But this faith, the Catholic faith orientation, was all-encompassing. All the clubs, the adult clubs and youth clubs were located here. You had church, you had school. And now what happened was in 1980, this parish closed down, and it was owned by the Archdiocese, and they tore the church down in about 6 months, which is what they did, because they wanted to obliterate the responsibility and memory of this as quickly as they could. And so that was a traumatic event for the parishioners here, but also for the neighborhood. Now the neighborhood was changing at that time. A lot of the parishioners had left, but were coming back here for church. This was becoming a Latino neighborhood. But it had 2 impacts. It kind of disconnected the folks that had been connected here, the white folks, completely from Lawrence. And it created this big hole in the middle of this neighborhood. And the commercial area, the retail area around here dried up and blew away. We had bakeries, there was a music store. I mean, this was a functional, all that went away in a period of about 5 years. And this property lay abandoned for about 25 years. And so when we started our work, Jessica and I and Alma and a few others, door knocking in the neighborhood, and And we were asking the question, this neighborhood was the neighborhood with the most vacant lots and abandoned buildings in the city. Our questions were, what should we do with the vacant lots and abandoned buildings? And people mostly said, well, actually, what can I do with my kids next weekend? That's my question. But ultimately, we got around to some land use planning, and this site obviously stood out as a big piece of what needed to be improved in the neighborhood. It's a big, dark, dangerous area in the neighborhood. And so we, back in 2001, actually 2000, took this on as one of 3 remarkable redevelopment pieces of this neighborhood that were kind of endorsed by the neighborhood voices as what needed to be redeveloped. And the use for this was assigned to community center. And the first thing that we did, because we didn't own the land, we didn't even know who owned it at the time, is we had a big mass out on this parking lot. We wanted to create a moment in this neighborhood around this piece of property that was essentially a transition. So we invited the white folks to come back who were part of this parish to have a reunion. And we invited the Latinos to come onto the site, and we had a mass right out here. We had about 500 people. And the spirit of that moment was, this used to be the center for families in this neighborhood. It's not going to be the same kind of center for families in this neighborhood, but we wanted to be a different center for families in this neighborhood. And as a result of that, the spirit of that moment, a planning and organizing team was put together of both folks, some of the old folks from the church who had networks of connections that they could bring to this challenge, and the local Latinos came together to form this team that ultimately, over 7-8 years, it took us 7 years to raise the money and redevelop this site, stayed with that over that period of time. So that was an important kind of spiritual moment, so to speak, and trying to kind of disconnect a little bit from the pain of the past, but create a new opportunity for something rich for the future. And we knew that was important because we knew that some of the spiritual stuff going on in this city at the time was not very forward-looking or productive, and we needed to kind of generate that. So that was an important moment. But it took us, as I said, about 7 years to get the money, to acquire the property, and redevelop the site. It's about a $6.5 million redevelopment, both buildings and the property. But we'll go through and kind of show you what our intentionality has been around the site. But one thing I want to point out is that when we were, and I think, Mark, this kind of gets to a couple of the questions about how do you start and how does the physical development connected to the network building. What we said to ourselves in the room that we had with, let's say, 40 or 50 residents and the staff, we had some honesty in that room where we said, look, it's going to take us, Lord knows, we don't even own the property. We don't have the money. And by the way, we actually don't know what's going to happen here. We say community center, but what does that really mean, right? So there's really a couple things that need to happen. We had this, coined this term a long time ago called moral site control. And the idea of moral site control is that you basically, as a community, just claim stuff. Say, that's ours. And you start acting as if it is. And so we decided we're going to use moral site control around this property. We decided in that moment, this is going to be our property, and we're going to start acting as if it's ours. And we did. And we needed to in order to acquire the property from the city. So we needed to do that. But we needed to recognize it's going to take us a long time. The second thing we need to do is we need to start doing the stuff that we imagine happening in this space. Because, people had a lot of ideas about, we'll do this, we'll do that, but we weren't doing any of it. We didn't know how to do anything. So we said, let's start doing it wherever we can do it. So by the time we have the space, we'll know what we're doing. And that idea was the germ for what has become Movement City ultimately, and what's become our family asset building work, because that stuff started as very small, self-organized, club-like stuff around architecture and fashion design and computer stuff and graphic design, 6 or 7 people coming together just to start doing it. And so by the time we had this property built out, and moved in 2007, we had built, from a programmatic standpoint, from kind of a network value proposition standpoint, and gotten good at and experienced at what we expected to be doing in here. In fact, this space, it scared us to move in because it was actually smaller than the space that we needed and that we're currently operating in kind of various locations around the city. So there was an iterative process of kind of weaving the physical development and the network building and the value proposition building stuff together that we tried to be intentional about and keeping that as organic as possible. As we look around the site, there's a number of things that happen here. There's our family asset building work that happens here. There's our Movement City, which is our youth network that happens here, and all the rest of Lawrence Community Works engine rooms. The resource development, financial. Our auditors are over there. You get to meet our auditors, which will be fascinating. And our community organizing and real estate development and home ownership center, all that stuff that happens in these spaces. So I hope that context is helpful. Why don't we take a walk? We'll start here, and we'll go upstairs to Moving City and then head over to Henry Center. Anything you want to add, Jessica?
No, I don't. Okay, I'll talk with I kind of want to dig into a lot of those questions that you guys have around this, because I think that they're fascinating. Some of them are things that we're grappling with right now, so I think we're going to have some really productive conversations about that. But it is really good to kind of get oriented in the space and the geography of what we do first. So